In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the first Star Trek episode I ever saw. After this. Hello out there, I'm the oldest nerd. I had seen a lot of bad science fiction. I was a fan of Fireball XL5 and Commando Cody and a lot of old stuff that could be seen in after-school television when I was in elementary school. And I was a pretty big fan of Lost in Space in its first season or so. I had a friend that was telling me about this other show called Star Trek. Now, I had heard about the show. It was on NBC. The promos that NBC put out on it were so bad, they made it sound like the Enterprise was some kind of freighter. And I thought, well, why would I want to watch something like that? It sounds all too stuffy for me. And so I preferred to watch The Family and the Flying Saucer that crash land and have the robot that cracks jokes and a bad guy that screams and whines. So it wasn't until the beginning of the second season of Star Trek that I even discovered it. And my neighbor across the street who had seen the first season said, "You've got to see this." And he came over when the first season episode was going to show. And we sat down together and he said, "Now watch this," when I saw the first transporter effect. The program was the Doomsday Machine. The Doomsday Machine, in retrospect, is one of the best original series episodes ever filmed. James Doohan, Mr. Scott, said that that was probably the one that used the most scientific accuracy and one of his favorites of the entire original series. There are other people, critics also called it maybe the fourth best show that Star Trek ever did in the original series. Dorothy Fontana, who wrote many of the scripts, said that that was her least favorite. Of course, she didn't write that one. She was a good writer, did some other very good programs, but not this particular one. The show was good in that in the second season, they were able to build more sets. The engineering section, for instance, on the Enterprise was a very simple room with a forced perspective and some boxes that looked like computers. They doubled that for Starfleet operations during the menagerie, and various redresses of the set were used for other things. But this is the first time that they had the dilithium chambers where they were supposed to be, and the second floor where you could come in and come down the ladders and things like that. That was all brand new for the second season. So engineering was a lot more defined, and they used that in the Doomsday Machine in order to show the Constellation's engineering room. The program itself was kind of a parable for the nuclear standoff that we were in during those years, where we had the Soviet Union with all missiles pointed at us and us with all missiles pointed at the Soviet Union, and this mutually assured destruction being the theory behind why we didn't just obliterate each other. And this idea of the Doomsday Machine was something that had been floated around. It's only recently said that Russia was probably working on one or made one or something. But the idea was that you have something so terrible that it would be too scary to use and nobody would ever use it. And in the case of this what if program, what if somebody built a Doomsday Machine and actually used it? What would be left? And the answer was, of course, nothing. And so it has gone into Federation space and has started going after planets that have been investigated by the Enterprise. And finally, they come upon the starship Constellation, which I believe is the first time in Star Trek that they ever showed another Federation starship. In this case, they used an AMT model. I had one of those kits, so I could tell it was even during the show because in watching it later, in that there was a problem in getting the nacelles lined up right. Always one would flop a little bit. And even in the model they used there, you'll notice that the right nacelle is not quite lined up properly on the Constellation. And that was because they were using like a 6-inch long plastic model kit. They had to show it wrecked and really didn't want to take one of their professional models and damage it in any way. So they could, for a couple of bucks, go to the hobby shop, put together a plastic model kit and use that, mostly in long shots for the Constellation. The direction of the show was by Mark Daniels. He was one of the best directors that worked for Star Trek, and he liked to have busy shots. That is to say, you didn't have your standard two-shot. It would be always somebody in the background. There would always be something else going on. So if you notice all of the shots, if you watch the Doomsday Machine, there's always a shot between, say, Spock and Decker with the communication officer, Palmer, I believe, in the background. Or when Kirk is talking to McCoy, the engineering and damage control crew are standing in the background. And the auxiliary control, which they built for this episode, had a screen and then a bank of controls behind it. The depth of which Mark Daniels used in most of his shots were something that gave a little more texture, enriching the visual way that the show was. Also, it was one of the few times that they ever walked all the way around the bridge, so you had an idea of what the bridge was like. Usually the screen was just shown in a shot over Sulu's shoulder. In this case, you have, in more than one case, Kirk walking the circumference of the bridge and walking against the view screen. This is also an unusual episode in that an entire score was written for it. Now, most of the time, most of the music for Star Trek was written pretty much at once, and then reused in various things to establish certain moods. But somehow they were able to, I guess, to make a splash in the second season, had an entire score written by Saul Kaplan. And they used parts of it throughout the series after that. But it was all done to where you could just play the score from the beginning to the end of the show and have a very logical piece of musical progression. Anyway, it all added to it. You could tell that things were happening before they happened by the fact that the music changed. You knew that Decker was going to die when the shuttlecraft was going into the planet killer. You knew, and in fact, before you saw the pictures of it. At one time, Bob Justman, the associate producer of Star Trek, said that in the day they had the budget for doing a good radio show. And in fact, if you turn the picture off on a lot of original series episodes, you could keep up with what was going on. Their special effects were such that they had to kind of describe what they were seeing anyway. So actually the whole series would make good radio shows. William Wyndham played Matt Decker. They originally wanted Robert Ryan, who wasn't available, but he played it differently. His own interpretation of the part, he didn't realize that he was supposed to be playing Captain Ahab, which was kind of the thought in the back of the minds of the writers for this episode. He was thinking more of Queeg from the Kane Mutiny, and in fact his moving of the microtapes in the captain's chair, he said he did that consciously as kind of a indication, like Queeg did with the ball bearings that he was constantly moving around in his hand. So that was part of how he played it. He also played it as someone with more PTSD than mania to go after the white whale, the great white. So all of that said, I found that I couldn't resist the show after that. That was enough of an episode, I think, in hindsight, that would have brought anybody into the series. I'm glad that I saw that first instead of, say, the Man Trap or Spock's Brain or some of the real clinkers in the original series. That was probably the best episode, certainly my favorite, and thankfully it was my first, and I became a Trekkie from that time on. I'd like to hear what you think. What was the first Trek episode you ever saw? I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you very much for joining us, and don't go far.